So let's start our discussion of ethical issues in clinical research, the foundation of everything that we do. In the next few slides, we're going to talk about the evolution of ethical issues relevant to clinical research. And I want to start just by reviewing some overall concepts. So the fundamental principle that underlies all clinical research is that subjects must be protected. In this quote that I've highlighted is from the Declaration of Helsinki that we're going to talk about in the next slide, which talks about that patients what must be protected is their health, well-being, and rights. Now, typically, we think of the informed consent as the mechanism by which we protect subjects, but the concept is actually much broader than that. It also refers to the nature of the research itself, as well as oversight of the research. And I think it's important to understand that the regulations and the guidances under which we conduct clinical research are intimately related to these ethical principles and reflect our responsibilities. The ICH Good Clinical Practice, ICH E6 Good Clinical Practice guideline is the fundamental standard that all companies use to conduct research, clinical research. And it covers both the ethical conduct of studies as well as other issues like procedures. So these have evolved from the Nuremberg Code, which was drafted in 1947 by the physicians who presided over the Nuremberg trials. Its perspective was of the rights of the subject and was really the first code to introduce the concept of informed consent and voluntary participate in trials as a reaction to the atrocities that were committed in World War II. And since it was first drafted, we can consider that over the years, these principles, many of which, like the Nuremberg Code, were drafted in response to tragedies, have been codified into rules and standards and included in the laws, regulations, and guidance documents that we follow today. So this slide summarizes some of the major milestones. Within the blue arrow are the codes and standards. Below the blue arrow are some regulations and events that are specific to the U.S. And above the blue arrow, I put some regulations that are specific to Europe. So following the Nuremberg Code, then the next major document that was prepared in 1964 was the Declaration of Helsinki by the World Medical Association. And what this did was add standards for physician researchers in conducting research and also introduce the concept of independent oversight. So this has been updated several times, and with GCP is considered the standard under which all clinical trials must be conducted. And when we write up the data in a clinical study report, we acknowledge that the research has been conducted in accordance with these two documents. So one thing I wanted to point out is that in 1966, a physician from the NIH, Dr. Henry Beecher, published a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine, and he described 20 examples of clinical studies containing ethical violations. It's interesting readings if you get the opportunity, if you have some time to look at it. And it demonstrates why almost 20 years after the Nuremberg Code was first drafted, additional requirements were still needed for clinical research. So in reaction to this, the U.S. Congress passed the National Research Act in 1974, which created a commission. And the commission then drafted the Belmont Report, which is one of the other landmark documents in establishing ethical standards. And its focus was on three ethical principles: respect for persons, beneficence, which was referred to as minimizing possible harms, as well as maximizing the benefits of research, and justice, which they referred to as avoiding the preferential selection of vulnerable subjects for inclusion in trials. And the Belmont Report then was the basis for additional regulations that were drafted by HHS and FDA. One other document that I want to point out here are the SIAMS guidelines. SIAMS is another international organization that drafts standards for clinical research. And these CIOMS guidelines added more detail about procedures, such as the choice of control groups and compensation of research subjects. So then all of these elements in these various reports then became incorporated into good clinical practice. So for the reason why I spent some time on this is that I think for all of us in clinical research, it's important to appreciate the history behind our current requirements, and it helps us understand the rationale for all of these requirements. So one way we can think of this evolution, as I mentioned earlier, is that we started with principles in these codes, and they've been rolled up into the rules that we follow today. So let's start with what is good clinical practice, and this is from the guidance document. And the definition, just to point out a couple of things, is that it's an ethical and scientific quality standard. It considers all aspects of the clinical trial, starting from designing the study through reporting. And its purpose is to provide the public with assurance that the rights, safeties, and well-being of subjects are protected, consistent with the Declaration of Helsinki, we see the link here, and that the clinical trial data are credible. So this is our roadmap. It applies to both this sponsor, investigator, has detailed template of the clinical trial protocol, which is what we're going to be discussing in the next 2 weeks, and provides a unified standard, and that is to facilitate acceptance by regulatory authorities. So it's the criteria, if protocols are conducted in accordance with it, that should ensure that health authorities can approve the products. It has the force of a law in many countries, but in the US it's a guidance document. I just want to make a comment about what a guidance document is in the FDA. It's considered to be voluntary. However, with respect to GCP, this is the worldwide standard and really should be followed by all sponsors. Dr. Emanuel from the NIH wrote a paper that was published in 2000 in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And it provides a framework for ethical principles as applied to clinical research, which he stated were to guide the ethical development, implementation, and review of individual clinical protocols. I thought it was a nice summary of ethical principles, so I've included it in this lecture. And what it does is it pulls together several ethical principles. I wanted to just go through these briefly. So the first requirement that he notes is social or scientific value, indicating that the research is of value to public health or well-being of patients or increasing scientific knowledge. The next requirement was scientific validity, that there are the use of standard methodology and techniques for analysis. Fair subject selection means that, again, this concept, vulnerable populations are included, and he also included here the rich and socially powerful, that they're not preferentially included in clinical trials. A favorable risk-benefit ratio indicates that there's always a trade-off between what's best for the individual patient and what's best for the society in conducting clinical research. So Emanuel stated with this requirement that the favorable risk-benefit means that the risks to subjects are proportionate to the benefits to the subject and society. Clinical trial protocols should have independent review by an organization that's unaffiliated with the sponsor or with the investigator. And we've talked a little bit about informed consent. And the last one is respect for potential and enrolled subjects. And Emanuel pulls this one out specifically as a separate requirement. And what he's referring to is the subject's autonomy and welfare, that subjects must be allowed to withdraw from the study, or their privacy must be respected, and also that newly discovered risks and benefits should be also communicated to patients.